Welcome to the Workamper Show, brought to you by Workamper.com. This podcast helps you discover how to finance your RV travel dreams. Each one of our episodes will introduce you to people who are already living the RV lifestyle or to work camping opportunities all around the U.S. You'll also learn how to hit the road the right way and make the most of every opportunity. Now let's turn over today's show to your host, Greg Gerber.
This week we will delve into the important topic of workers' compensation insurance. It can be a big help for workers injured on the job, but a tricky requirement for employers to navigate. Today's episode is brought to you by the featured employers at Workamper.com. These Workamper employers have taken the extra step to share some photos and detailed information about their Workamper programs with you. So check them out today. Opportunities exist for solos, couples, and families, whether they are full-time, part-time, seasonal, or even long-term jobs. Some are income opportunities, and others involve volunteering at locations throughout the United States. Go to www.workamper.com/FE to meet the featured employers today. If you are an employer seeking to hire Workampers, then you can learn how to benefit from year-round recruiting by becoming a featured employer. Visit www.workamper.com/FE details. Today's guest is Irene Jones. She's an insurance professional with more than 14 years of experience in the campground and hospitality industry. Irene helped develop a national campground insurance program with Marshall & Sterling, and she has a deep understanding of how workers' compensation affects employers and employees in this unique line of work. Today she works as an independent insurance consultant helping businesses of all types with their insurance needs. In this conversation, Irene explains what workers' compensation is, why it exists, and how it protects both sides when a workplace injury occurs. Whether you own a business or work as a seasonal employee, it's important to understand how this insurance functions because it determines what happens if you or someone you work with gets hurt while on the job. By the end of this episode, you'll have a much clearer understanding of what workers' compensation covers, how it applies to the work camping world, and why every employer and employee should take it seriously. To tell us more, please welcome independent insurance consultant Irene Jones to the show. Thanks for joining me today, Irene. I really appreciate it. How long have you been in the campground and hospitality industry?
Thanks for having me, Greg. I have been in the industry for almost 14 years now.
14 years. Okay. Primarily with one company?
Yeah, I developed a national campground insurance program with Marshall & Sterling, and we built it organically from the ground up. And I think that the thing that I was most proud about with that project was the attention that we gave to the campground owners with resources and solutions. So we looked at insurance protection, but we also looked at proactive safety protection and how we could help campground owners advance their business. And that's what made it successful.
Very good. We are going to talk about workers' compensation today, both from an employer's perspective and from an employee's perspective. Let's start with the employers. What is it? If you were to describe it to an employer succinctly so they could understand what workers' compensation means to them, what would that be?
Workers' compensation for a business is insurance that covers you if your employees are injured in the course of doing work. It's not disability insurance. That's if they get injured outside of work. It's in the course of doing their job. And if they are injured, it covers them for medical bills and for time off of work. And then if that work injury did actually cause a long-term disability or death, there would be some coverage for that as well.
Okay. So it's primarily not a disability kind of insurance. So it is something that just covers an accident that took place at work, whatever it might be.
Exactly. Workplace injury or illness. Yes.
So it covers like hospital costs, emergency room visits, etc., any kind of drugs that they might have to as they heal through this illness.
Yes.
Okay.
And the thing that is distinct about workers' compensation insurance is it was designed to have the employer have goodwill towards the employee and to make it easy for the employee to be made whole if they're injured on the job. So when you have workers' compensation insurance as a business, that is the sole remedy for that workplace injury. And then they cannot sue you for negligence except in some rare cases like black lung disease or some extreme negligent disease. But your typical, I fell off the ladder, if you have workers' compensation insurance, there's not going to be a lawsuit from that. It's just going to go to the sole remedy for the workers' comp for medical bills, lost wages, etc.
I remember that it likely came out of the mining industry, if I'm not mistaken, because back then when they had a mine accident or something and a worker was injured, that was it. They were on their own at that point. They lost their job and they didn't have any other income. And so workers' compensation was developed to provide that kind of stability. Is that correct? Do you remember?
Yes, and as the Industrial Revolution continued and factory workers and workers' rights movements developed concurrently, the need to protect workers on the job and to have workplace safety, which is then you get into the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, of having safety standards, went hand in hand with developing workers' compensation as a sole remedy for workplace injuries. But there's always exceptions to everything. And in the USA, we like to do insurance on a state by state basis. So there's a lot of asterisks that go with it. It's required, except for when it's not required. So I think that's something to bring up. Some states do not require it. If they don't require it at all, whether because it's just simply not required or they don't require it until you have a certain number of employees, 1, 3, 5, whatever it is, then in that case, the employee can actually go ahead and sue the employer. So there's always a remedy, but workers' compensation, even when it's not required in some states, often employers will purchase it because it makes it simple. It's a good way to transfer the risk and protect your business from paying out medical bills, from paying out lost wages, from dealing with a lawsuit. It just makes it easier for you to have goodwill with your employees as well. So it is a sound insurance product for your protection and also for the development of your business.
It sounds like it. That's pretty impressive that it's not required by all of the states. That's one of the questions I was going to ask. Is this a federal program or a state program? And it sounds like it's a state, so it can vary widely from state to state.
It can. And so it's important to, as a business owner, when you're shopping for workers' compensation, to ask your insurance broker what is required of me for my employees and what must I do? Because in some states where it is required, if you do not have the coverage, you're subject to fines and penalties, and they can be quite stiff. So you really need to ask for your specific situation. And then you have to also ask about how your business is structured, whether it's an LLC, a corporation. In my state, I have this business structure. Here are the LLC members. Here are the corporate officers. Do we have to be included on workers' compensation? Can we decline it? Are there any minimum payrolls that are involved? Ask those questions, because what happens with workers' compensation is you go and you set up a policy. It's all based on what you're estimating your payroll for your staff will be and what you're choosing to include or exclude for your corporate officers and how you're setting up your wages and what the state requires you to do with corporate officer wages. All of those things you need to consult with an insurance broker to guide you on your specific situation.
I've only had one employee in my life when I was working for myself, and that was a surprise to me because the state of Montana knocked on my door saying, "Where's your workers' compensation?" And I'm like, "Whoa, wait a minute. I'm headquartered in Arizona. Why would I need workers' compensation in Montana? That's where your at-home employee works." So I was shocked that even at-home employees were covered by workers' compensation.
That's a good perspective. I think the thing that comes up a lot in the campground industry is we've got somebody who just wants to mow the lawns. And I've seen this before. Listen, Larry's here. He's a seasonal. He loves to be on the mower. We've got a big lawn. It works for me. It works for him. If that works until there's a problem. I've seen exactly that situation. And then riding the mower down the hill and it tumbles. And now all of a sudden someone's got a broken hip. And guess what? Larry's 72. And it's a little bit more of a serious injury than if Larry were 42. And all of a sudden, where's the policy? Because the medical bills are piling up. So you've got to think about, first of all, one thing that people will ask me is, are there volunteers coverage for workers' compensation? There's no volunteers. There's no volunteers. If that works until there's a problem. I've seen exactly that situation. And then the at a for-profit company. So if you have people working under your direction, whether they're W-2 or 1099, make the assumption that they should be covered on workers' compensation insurance. Unless you have a true independent contractor who's coming in, a good example in the campground industry is maybe you hire a cleaning company. That cleaning company has their own equipment, they have their own staff, they're providing you a certificate of insurance showing commercial general liability and workers' comp insurance. That's a 1099, that's a independent contractor. But if you're just hiring Larry to mow the lawn for 4 hours a week, then pay him at least minimum wage and include that in your estimated payroll for workers' comp. Does that make sense?
It does, yes. What kinds of things does workers' comp cover then? When does it pay out to an employer or an employee?
So it would pay out to the employee. So let's follow that claims example of poor Larry who's going and he gets injured. What he's going to be required to do is report it right away to the employer. So you want to train your employees if there is an injury that they let you know and you help them get medical attention. And then as the employer, you would help to place an insurance claim with the workers' compensation insurance policy. And typically that policy will help then to do any required reporting to the state, which will vary from state to state. And then the next thing would be, or concurrently, you have to get medical attention and then see what the medical bill is. You're going to be submitting those medical bills through workers' compensation insurance, not medical insurance. If say you had someone who was working there full time and they got injured and they couldn't collect their wages because of the injury. So those lost wages would be paid by workers' compensation. So the employer has to report it, has to work with the employee and the insurance company through the claim, and should also be prepared to have a return to work program. So someone's got a broken hip or an injury, maybe they can't do the grounds work, but maybe they can do some paperwork inside. So you ease them back into working.
Okay, that's a good thing to note. When a 1099 employee they're not employees, with a 1099 contractor is involved with a company and they get injured, they're not covered at all then by workers' compensation. Is that correct? They're fully on their own. If they wanted to be covered by that, they would have to get it for themselves.
I think the issue with 1099 is not black and white, it's gray. So if you have someone who is a contractor, as I described, where they are a contractor coming in to do electrical work or cleaning work and they have their own insurance, those workers are going to make that insurance claim under them, under that other business. But if you're a campground and you have a 1099 employee, there is a Department of Labor litmus test that determines what are these workers under the control of you for their behavior? Are you determining where they do the work? Financially, are you providing the tools and the means for them to do the work? Are you directing the work? Are they truly working independently? So what I see is that when a claim happens, a lot of times that 1099 employee who was really under your direction will get picked up on the workers' compensation. So and the problem is if you do not purchase that coverage in the first place. So I think that my best advice would be to look at workers' compensation as part of your risk management strategy and to consider people who are 1099 as casual workers but still under your direction. Consider their payroll in your estimated annual payroll when you're working to determine what your payroll will be for the year with workers' compensation. So when you're working with an insurance agent, if you were my client, Greg, I would say, how much payroll do you think you're going to have for grounds? How much payroll do you think you're going to have for clerical? And those are important questions because the grounds crew, the cost could be $4 per $100 worth of payroll for workers' comp. The clerical crew, that could be 35 cents per $100 worth of payroll for workers' comp. So a smart thing you can do when you're thinking about structuring this with your business is if you have someone who's clerical, and just keep them clerical. Now, we all know that there's going to be times where you have that person who's a jack of all trades, the guy who's out there and doing the grounds work, but will also check people in. But if you have someone who's really just going to be in the store and running the office, then don't have her running the mower. You know why? You're going to have higher insurance costs, and B, you want people to be trained in the jobs that they're doing, oriented to working on the machines, documentation that you're following the OSHA standards for safety. Keep it as professional and organized as you can, and gives you a safety benefit that reduces claims, that makes your insurance cheaper over a long time. And then if you divide up the labor into different categories, you can manage costs that way by having lower insurance premiums just by rating classifications.
I would imagine some Workamper employers are going to be surprised by that suggestion that they separate them into specific duties, because they do hire workers to do other things as assigned kind of thing. And so their jobs are all over the place.
And it may not be realistic for everybody, but where it is, it's a good strategy.
Okay.
That's a good point.
Is there a penalty for not having this insurance?
There is if it's required by law.
Okay.
In most states, it is required by law, at least once you get to a certain head count of employees. In many states, when you hire anybody, it's required. So if you don't have it, an example would be Connecticut or New York, very strict if they find that you had employees and didn't have workers' compensation. You better place coverage, you better place it timely. If not, they can fine you daily.
Oh my goodness, that sounds expensive.
It could be, yes.
So what happens if an employee is injured in a camp or at an employer who does not have unemployment insurance? Can they still get any kind of help? Or is that something the state would come in?
So if an employee is injured and the business does not have workers' compensation insurance, then that opens up the employer to a lawsuit for personal injury.
Okay, so the state wouldn't come in, but the employee could sue them for not having this kind of coverage.
Yeah, so that would be the means to take care of the employee, but the state would also come in and then assign fines and penalties to the employee for not being in compliance with state workers' comp laws. So you're getting it both ways.
Okay. Is there a limit to the amount of benefits that are paid out under a claim like this or under insurance like this?
It's for the medical bills. No, it's not limited, but you do have to show there are checks and balances, and they're quite good. So you have to show documentation about the medical. Many times there's requirements that you go to certain doctors within the workers' compensation network. There's requirements of the employees that they keep regular appointments, that they check in. And so there are some good checks and balances there. The idea of it is to make the employee whole. And again, if you have workers' compensation insurance, you're paying for the medical bills through the insurance. You're paying for the lost wages, but there's not a lawsuit for pain and suffering. Whereas in states like Texas, where workers' comp is not required, if you choose as an employer not to carry workers' comp, you can be then sued for personal injury as well and for pain and suffering. That's why many times employers will choose to have workers' compensation, regardless of state requirements. Hey, maybe your state requires you to start it at 3 employees, and it's just easier and smarter to go ahead and start it once you start hiring.
I was going to say that it's because it is an insurance product. It's always safer to have it before you need it than to realize that you should have gotten it when you had the fire or whatever, the flood, whatever the expense was going to be that could have covered the expenses when an incident happened.
And there's a couple of ways that you can get workers' compensation insurance if you're a business owner. One is through your insurance broker. So if you're working with a person who is placing your commercial insurance for your property, your liability, your business auto, they can add a workers' compensation policy to that program. The advantage there is that oftentimes they can coordinate the coverage on similar dates. They can even have an umbrella policy go over some of the employer's liability sections of the workers' comp, which is an advantage for you and very inexpensive. And I think probably the biggest advantage there is often insurance brokers have a much more in-depth understanding of workers' comp laws and claims. And so when there is a claim, they can effectively guide you through the process and advocate for you as the employer. And there's a lot of crossover too of, is this situation a general liability or a workers' compensation situation? How do I handle it? What are the regulatory requirements? That's one option. The other option is that you can go through your payroll company, and that could be a really good option as well. What I like about that is heard me mention a few times, you as the business owner have to talk about your estimated payroll. If you're going through a payroll company, it's going to take out what the premium would be based on your weekly payrolls. So that really helps with flexibility in payments and automates everything. So that's the big advantage of the payroll companies. If you go that route, I would ask about their claim services and how you would get support in the event of a claim. And I would just make sure that I vet that properly to your satisfaction.
So if an employee is injured on the job and they file a workers' comp claim, then everything goes to the workers' comp company. They are the representative of the employee or employer. Is that correct? They're handling everything from that point on?
They handle everything, but the employer will still have to comply with any investigation, any
Right.
information, et cetera. If you have an injured worker as the employer, you should be doing an incident report. You should be
Yes.
documenting witnesses. You should be providing that information and working in conjunction with the insurance company claims unit.
That's a good point on documentation as well. Should you be documenting every employee injury, whether it's small or medium or large?
You absolutely should for a lot of reasons. One, it's a good practice overall just to have an eye on safety. For every near miss, there's one incident. And for every incident, like for every 10 near misses, there's one incident, I should say. So for every 10 near misses, there's one incident. That's important. For every incident that's small, if you look at those small incidents, you're going to avoid a big catastrophic incident. So looking at what is happening and getting out ahead of it can be one of your best protections. And it seems mundane when you're doing these safety reviews, but these are the things that make good organizations great. Looking at the trends, addressing them, talking about them with your team, and identifying maybe we need to do more training. Maybe we need to change something in our routine. I think if you think about workers' compensation, you really back it up. If I go back to my love of proactive safety, thinking about training your staff on using tools, on using machinery, on when to ask for help, how to do a two-man lift. Even things, Greg, I've seen it where you have someone who's working there, they live on site, and they go to take a walk at lunch and they get bit by a dog. Is that workers' comp or is that so having clear definitions of when you're working, when you're not working, clocking in and clocking out, making it lunch is a little gray, but certainly after you clock out at night, you're not working anymore. You're a camper if you're living there at the campground. So it's thinking about the things that could happen and clearly communicating, training your staff, documenting your training. And that's another reason you don't want to just throw somebody into a position from the office, say, to go mow the lawn if they haven't been trained on that mower. Even if you decide to do that, make sure that you have a way to orient and train them before you send them out there.
There are some times where the camp hosts are working around the clock, technically. So I don't know if they are ever off the clock, really, because people can come and knock on their door if they have a problem day or night at some of these smaller campgrounds, especially like the Forest Service and things like that. Is that?
Yeah, I think that being on call is a little bit different than being on duty all the time. It's
Right.
like continuous hours. I would think that maybe a
Okay.
little bit different, but that's a good point. There availability is a big issue in our industry. I think that it also is a smart idea to look at your business structure. It's going to vary greatly if you're a mom and pop campground and you're trying to get a work camper in to ease some of the burden, or if you're have someone who's there if you're privately owned, you have someone who's there full time all summer, or if you have a whole staff. So I think that we're talking about the workers' compensation perspective. There's legal and accounting aspects of this too. And I always say you've got your three professionals: your insurance professional, your legal professional, and your accountant. And asking about how you're handling your workers to all three of them, and then making a plan that works for your business structure, is a wise thing to do.
Earlier, you had mentioned that the rates for workers' compensation insurance depends upon the job classification. How often would employers or should employers be reviewing these classifications to make sure that they have enough coverage for everybody on their team?
Annually, you should be looking and talking with your insurance professional annually and looking at the type of work that you have done and the payroll for that work. And then also your owners and whether they should be included or not. If they're not going to be included, how does that impact you? Are there any forms that need to be signed? So you want to do that annually prior to your renewal. But something else that you should know about workers' compensation is that it is always audited. So if you say to me, if I was your insurance agent and you say to me, I have a big operation, I have $250,000 worth of payroll for my staff. That's what I'm estimating for this year. And we put 100,000 in clerical and 150 down for grounds work. And then at the end of the year, after the policy is ended, the insurance company is going to contact you and ask you for those payroll records that supports what actually happened. So if the payroll is lower, you'll get a refund. If it's higher, you'll get an additional bill. And that's normal.
Okay.
So workers' comp audits are normal, but it's something to be aware of.
I was not aware that they even did that. So that's cool. It prevents the fraud from taking place from an employer saying all of my staff members are clerical workers when they're out there digging ditches and fixing electrical boxes and all that other kind of stuff where they would incur greater chances of injury and things like that. So the audit will eliminate that as well. Is there any audits for employee fraud on workers' compensation?
That would be more of a claim. That would be more of a claims investigation for fraud.
Okay.
So yeah, if you are in a situation where someone is making a claim and you feel as the employer that there may be fraud involved, it's your duty to bring that to your insurance broker and also the insurance carrier and adjuster and say, here are the reasons in the documentation I think that fraud may be involved. And the insurance industry certainly wants to prevent fraud and values that partnership with employers. It's not always easy to prove, but we have to push back against it if you think that there's something going on.
When you had said that the audit may result in a refund, is it more advantageous then for an employer to gauge high in the classification, the risk for that particular employee, and then think it's going to be settled out at the end, than to underestimate and then have a situation occur later in the year where a poorly classified employee does wind up injured? Does that make sense?
It does. I think it's a little bit like having taxes taken out of your
Right.
paycheck. What you really want to do is try to get it as accurate as possible, and erring on the side of caution and being a little bit high may be a little bit easier to get that refund at the end. I think there's a few key things that I would do if I were a campground owner and I was sitting down to get a workers' comp policy. Is I would go through your overall payroll, the classifications of who's doing what's work, and the ownership, who's doing what work, what they're being paid, and if there are any forms that need to be signed for owners to opt out of workers' compensation. And also ask the question, are there any minimum payrolls that I'm required to pay workers' compensation on? So for example, if you opt in some states as an executive director of an organization, there might be a minimum payroll of $80,000, even if that person's only getting paid $50,000. So you're going to have to pay the difference.
Okay.
Is it material? We have to ask and see. If it's 30 cents per hundred, it's not material. If it's $4 per hundred, that's material. So you really have to get into the weeds with your particular situation, but ask those questions and try to get it as close as possible. That's why people like to have the pay as you go, either through a payroll company or a lot of workers' compensation carriers will link into your payroll company, even if you go through a broker, so that you're getting payroll reporting so it's as accurate as possible. That's the most popular, is if you can get some type of pay-as-you-go link to payroll, it eliminates a lot of headaches.
It sounds like it. From an employee's perspective, what if you're a volunteer? How are you covered if you get injured?
You're volunteering for a nonprofit?
Yes.
Okay, because you can't volunteer for a for-profit. A lot of people will ask me that at campers. So if you're volunteering for a nonprofit, I would ask the nonprofit
Okay.
how you would be covered. Often, I've done a lot of work with nonprofits in the course of my 25-year insurance career. Sometimes you can endorse a workers' comp policy. There'll be a rider on there to cover volunteers. Typically, volunteers are going to be covered under their own medical insurance
Okay.
or a volunteer accident medical policy. So I think that if you're going in the direction of a nonprofit campground and volunteers, then you need to start to think about volunteers as employee light, is how I think about it. Like, you still want to orient them, you still want to train them. You want to ask the question of, how are we going to deal with workplace injuries for volunteers, because we're a nonprofit campground and this is part of our business model, and then have a conversation with your insurance agent about where the coverage is and how you communicate that with the volunteers.
I think volunteers primarily come in with museums and things like that. Sometimes the nonprofits run a program where they could use volunteers to be docents at the lighthouse kind of thing, or at Forest Service or U.S. Army Corps of Engineer properties. Those are most often volunteer positions as well. Is that impacted by that at all? If they're working for the government?
If they're working for the government, it's a completely different situation. I think for the purposes of campgrounds, there are some nonprofit campgrounds out there. And what I would be very careful of is if you have volunteers doing work that is with machinery like chainsaws, going up on roofs. I've seen that in camps, worked in the camp industry for a long time. So you really want to be mindful, if you are a nonprofit campground, about what your volunteer policy is. And again, treat volunteers as employee light.
Okay, very good. One more question. Should employees ask if they're covered under workers' compensation before they start jobs? Is that a good idea for them?
I think it's great advice. In our industry, if you're, Greg, you were sharing with me that you traveled the country in an RV, and a lot of people travel the country in an RV and they work as they camp. And so if I were in that position, after listening to this podcast or hearing this information, I would want to know, do they have workers' compensation insurance? What will happen to me if I'm injured here in the course of doing work? It's your right to know. If you go in the break room where workers' compensation is required, there'll be like a posting where they have the minimum wages for that
Right.
state. So you want to post your proof of workers' compensation there. And it will vary a little bit from state to state, but that's a reasonable question to ask. It also will be in your orientation package typically. I also think that employees should be aware, and so should employers, that if you're getting housing as part of your remuneration, even though you're not being paid a wage, that's considered to be, the fair market value of that housing is considered to be reportable for workers' comp. If you have, it's $5,000 to be a seasonal and you're getting, quote unquote, a free seasonal site, that's $5,000 worth of labor. And so that's what you would put in as your payroll when you're figuring that out for workers' comp if you're the employer. But you would also expect, as an employee, that's entitling you to workers' compensation insurance.
Good to know.
Now, yeah, and I will refer the business owners to their attorneys to talk about meeting minimum wage. That's not my area of expertise as an insurance person, but I've been told time and time again that $5,000, for example, seasonal site, if you're working someone 40 hours a week all summer, that's not covering even minimum wage. A lot of times the suggestion that I see is to work out what your work hours are going to be for your work campers and have that, say you're going to wind up paying them $15,000 in minimum wage throughout the summer, have the first $5,000 of it be credited towards their housing. and work it out that way. Those are some ideas. I would consult with an attorney about that. But from a workers' compensation insurance perspective, the important thing to remember is you need to report that remuneration of the complementary housing as wages.
Excellent to note. People had questions and needed more advice than the things that I had covered. How could they connect with you?
You can connect with me on LinkedIn, Irene Jones, or you can reach me at irenejones_123@yahoo.com.
Very good. Thank you for your time today, Irene. I really appreciate it. Workers' compensation can be confusing from an employer's perspective and an employee's perspective. For employers, it can be very costly, but the money is well spent if there is ever an injury. So it's something that they really need to look at and make sure that it's all shored up. From an employer's perspective, it's always nice to know that they're going to be covered if they ever have an accident. Employers and employees both benefit from workers' compensation, it looks. And I thank you for sharing your time today.
Thank you so much, Greg. It's a pleasure to be here. Good insurance coverage like workers' compensation supports the success of the campground community, and that's what we are all committed to. So thank you so much for having me.
I really appreciate independent insurance consultant Irene Jones for coming on the show to talk about some common misconceptions about what workers' compensation is about and what it covers. Workers' compensation can be confusing, especially when people mix up the differences between W-2 employees, 1099 contractors, and volunteers. Irene reminded us that classification matters because it determines whether an injury is covered or not. So if you're a W-2 employee, you're usually covered under your employer's workers' compensation policy, and that pays for medical bills and lost wages if you're hurt on the job. But if you're working as a 1099 independent contractor, then you're typically on your own. Contractors are responsible for carrying their own insurance, and they're not covered under an employee's policy unless state regulators later decide they were misclassified. Volunteers working at for-profit organizations are in a gray area. Irene made it clear that there are no true volunteers in any for-profit business. Volunteers working for a nonprofit organization may be covered under a special policy, or they may need to rely on their own insurance. So if you're working in exchange for a free RV site or any other benefit that has a monetary value, then that should be treated as wages for insurance purposes. The key takeaway is this. Before starting any job, ask your employer whether they carry your workers' compensation insurance and whether you're covered under it. That simple question could save a lot of confusion and financial hardship if an accident ever prevents a work camper from being able to work, even for a short time. For more information about workers' compensation, the U.S. Commerce Department has set up a special website addressing frequently asked questions. There's a link to that site in the show notes. Today's episode was sponsored by Workamper News. Much more than just a job listing website, when you put the tools of this professional service into action, you'll find out just how easy it can be to turn your work camping dreams into reality. A Workamper membership opens the door to a one-stop shop for all things work camping. Being the original resource for work camping, you'll find the largest number of job listings, be able to connect with a community of work campers, and view resources compiled by experts who've been enjoying the RV lifestyle for many years. So if you're serious about leading a successful and enjoyable work camping lifestyle, then membership is for you. Join today at www.workamper.com. Embark on new adventures today with the support of Workamper News behind you. That's all for this week's show. I'll have another interesting interview on the next episode of The Workamper Show. Thank you for listening.